Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session for production organizations. We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so and wait for people to enter the webinar before we kick off. Right, it looks like we have a fairly full house now, so we'll kick off. Good afternoon and welcome to this session of our series of webinars on EU exit. This one is for production organizations. My name is Will Nathan. I'm Head of External Relations here at the UK Civil Aviation Authority. You can find the full list of our webinar series at our dedicated EU exit microsite, which is at info.caa.co.uk/EU exit. I'm sure you're all familiar with that microsite by now. Today we'll be hearing from Steve Horton, Mark Barker and Michael Greer on those issues affecting production organizations, specifically in a no-deal scenario. There will be time at the end of this session for a Q&A, and you can submit your questions throughout the presentation using the button at the bottom of the screen as opposed to putting your hands up. I would encourage you as best you can to wait until the end of the webinar, or at least the end of the formal presentation, before asking your questions, as many of these might be answered through the course of the content provided during the webinar. And as there are quite a few people on this session today, while we'll do our best to cover everyone and get to everyone's questions at the end of the session, we may not get to everyone. If we don't get to you, we will have your email address and your question, provided that you don't submit it as anonymous, and we will be able to follow up with an email clarifying the question for you. And finally, just so you're aware, we will be recording these sessions and making them available after. So everyone who received the invite for the session will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this webinar in it. If we just move on to the next slide, please. Quickly going through the agenda here and the issues that we'll be covering firstly the new regulatory framework as at the 1st of January 2021, before we move on to continued validity of UK POA approvals. What do POA organisations have to do for the 1st of January 2021? What needs to be approved by the UK CAA? What are the other effects? And what about other bilateral agreements, followed by the Q&A session that I mentioned before. Now, without further ado, I'll pass over to Steve Horton, who'll be covering the new regulatory framework.
Thank you, Will, and good afternoon, all of you. I'm going to take you through the new regulatory framework that will be in place at the end of this year. And we'll start off with the next slide, please, Judy. Okay. Currently, we are in a transition period. Officially, we left the EU on the 31st of January, beginning of this year, following the ratification of the Withdrawal Agreement. Now, that agreement included a transition period which takes us up until the 31st of December. During this period, all the agreements and the Aviation Acquis still continue to apply to us here in the UK. Now, as you're more than well aware, the negotiations are ongoing at this time, and included in those is a long-term UK-EU aviation relationship. But the UK will no longer be a participant in the EASA system after the transition period ends on the 31st of December. Next slide, please. Now, we have the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018. Now, this brings the EU legislation that will form part of UK domestic law if it is in force and in effect on the 31st of December this year. Now, the EU Aviation Acquis is brought across into UK law under the Withdrawal Act, and there are numerous secondary law instruments that you'll hear the term statutory instrument, or SI, have been made under the Act to make the legislation operable in the UK. Now, that's only to change some of the terminology, but the substantive requirements, the technical content of the EU regulation remains unchanged. And one important point here, that there is no change to the identity of the regulations. And there's two examples there on the slide. So what is currently referred to as a regulation EU in brackets, then the number or commission regulation, they stay the same. The identity to all the regulations do not change. Next slide, please. So just want to go on to future development of the UK aviation safety. Now, at the end of the transition period, at the end of December, the UK will be responsible for the development of aviation safety policy and regulation. In conjunction with the DFT, we are establishing a capability to do this work, which will start from the start of 2021. So this provides us with an opportunity on how we develop aviation safety policy in the future, and where we can better involve industry in the decision making and develop those rules more flexibly. There will be an annual program of change derived from a prioritization of the various demands that exist at the time. We are currently developing the program of change for 2021, and that will be published towards the end of this year. Now, talking about the program of change for next year, this is really to catch up on some of the EU regulations that are currently have currently been released but won't be in effect at the end of the year, some ICAO SARPs, and some deregulatory measures and general aviation matters. Next slide. So I'll pass on to Mark for the next part.
Hello, thanks, Steve. It's Michael Greer, actually, Steve. I'm going to do the next few slides. First of all, I am the Principal Surveyor in the UK CAA Airworthiness Department for Production. And I'll do a few slides and then pass on to my manager, Mark. So, first of all of the following slides are to assist in the preparation for no agreement. On the 20th of October 2020, the UK and EU governments announced an intensification of trade discussions, which the CAA has been supporting, but from which the outcomes are not yet confirmed. CAA will issue additional communications should the situation change from that presented here. And it would be inappropriate for us to speculate further on potential outcomes during this presentation, other than to confirm that the UK CAA has continued to advise the UK government in seeking maximum possible extent of mutual recognition to minimise the impact on industry. And those discussions are ongoing, and hopefully we will get some resolution. But as I say, all slides to assist in preparation for no agreement. Next slide, please. Importantly, Steve has mentioned that the regulation references stay the same, so your approval remains valid as it was granted by the UK CAA as the competent authority for production. And the legal basis on which it was issued, including the EC regulation references, now forms part of UK law. So there is no application process to the CAA to transfer your current UK POA to a UK CAA approval, because it already has that status. It is not a transfer or conversion. So your approval reference, therefore, will remain unchanged. The regulation references on your approval certificate remain correct, so it and the terms of approval associated with it remain valid. The UK POA approval remains recognised for production within the UK, i.e. by other UK POAs and UK operators, and by UK bilateral partners. Currently, we have bilateral agreements or working arrangements with US, Canada, Brazil, Japan, and Singapore. And at present, there is no recognition by the EU for releases after the 31st of December 2020. Next slide, please. What do I need to do for the 1st of January 2021. Next slide. So what you must do is start to use the CAA Form 1, format for production releases from the 1st of January 2021. For all other releases from your approved sites and from any subcontractors that you have authorised to release on your behalf, either in the UK or overseas. This is the only change a UK POA has to make immediately to remain in compliance with the UK Part 21 requirements. There are obviously other effects that we will come to shortly, but this is what you absolutely must do for your releases to remain legally valid. If you have not already planned to introduce this change in your system and trained your certifying staff in readiness, you should do so now. So even if an agreement is signed, the UK being able to continue to use the EASA Form 1 is not an anticipated outcome, so you must be ready for this change. Next slide, please. Here we have the CAA Form 1 Authorised Release Certificate template. I will just point out where that has changed from the EASA Form 1, and it is basically Block 1, where it says UK CAA. Block 2, where it says CAA Form 1 instead of EASA Form 1. And at the very bottom, outside of the box, where it says CAA Form 1, Issue 1, Template Only. Those are the only changes from the EASA Form 1. Okay. Next slide, please. What else needs? So exposition changes to introduce the CAA Form 1. So we would not require you to submit an exposition change to the CAA in order to make this change as you would normally have to. As this is an identical change across all 150 POAs, we are not requiring this as it would create significant industry and CAA workload with no benefit. You should include the release certificate change in the next routine revision of the exposition that you would normally submit to the CAA. The CAA will implement any necessary formatting changes, etc., to the approval certificate on a rolling basis as the need for such amendments arise. The inclusion of an amended approval certificate should be included in the agreement of the draft exposition and not then generate another amendment agreement cycle. We only want to do this once. Next slide. I think that is over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, thanks, Julia. Next slide, please. Okay, so Michael has basically taken you through the known knowns, for want of a better phrase. The main impact, obviously, that you'll be understanding as an organisation, as a production organisation, is that lack of EU recognition of the Form 1 as an authorised release certificate after the 31st of December 2020. You'll be aware, and if not, these are referenced from the CAA site that Will has mentioned, that EASA has established TCOs, third country organisation approvals, for those companies to seek agency approval to continue to supply to EU customers with an EASA Form 1. And you do need to look at your own business profile to identify the business need, the business case for whether you should apply or not. And we are aware that the majority of organisations have done so. We have maintained very close liaison with OCAO and the various other bilateral partners that we have to be able to maximise the acceptance of the CAA Form 1 by other authorities. And Part 1 UK, Part 145s that you supply to have been given some additional guidance on 2 slides which will follow, which we'll see in a minute. However, for the organisations in the EU and further worldwide, to avoid delays on receipt of your documentation and your product after the 1st of January, you should confirm with your customers whether a CAA Form 1 release is acceptable to their home authority or not, because at the very least you might need to get an update to the purchase order or contract terms to allow you to supply on a CAA Form 1 if the contract that you have signed says you will supply on an EASA Form 1, because you will not be able to do that after the 1st of January unless you have sought an EASA third country approval. We will be happy to provide background to other authorities on request to facilitate acceptance. There is actually a tab for other authorities on the EU Exit microsite element of the CAA website. However, we have to point out that whether a state or its authority accepts the CAA Form 1 or not is a decision for that individual authority. We can't guarantee it, but we will obviously do what we can to support, and with the reputation of the CAA behind it, to be able to assure the organisation or the country that they can accept the items, but it is down to their discretion. We cannot guarantee it for you. Next slide, please, Julia. Okay, so Steve has made reference to the statutory instruments and the fact that we are coming out of the transition period and we're now moving into this thing called the recognition period. From the 1st of January 2021, the UK maintenance organisations must only use components which are deemed acceptable within the UK legislation. So what this means is that if you are supplying to a UK maintenance organisation who is supporting an operator with the installation of replacement spare parts or retrofit parts, then these are the guidelines that have been issued through the webinars that have just been held with the 145 community last week. And to just really lay it down, it's bullet point that those organisations in the UK can accept a CAA Form 1 for new or used parts. They can accept an EASA Form 1 parts for the parts acceptable for the next 2 years as part of the recognition period. But this does not include those third country approvals that have been issued to UK organisations. So we'll come to that element a little later as well, but the first mention there that you need to maintain a UK CAA approval if you are going to supply to the UK or to our bilateral partners. And then under the bilateral airworthiness agreement, new or used parts in accordance with the applicable bilateral agreement documentation. Next slide, please. Okay, and we have created some flow charts, not expecting people to be able to read those from the screens, but these will be available on the presentation to come in terms of a simple flow of what you need to do if you are procuring a new part or a component from within the UK, from within the EU, or from overseas. And the different levels of acceptable documentation, yes, no, are contained within those flows, but basically explain what I've just gone through with you by text. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've mentioned this element that we're now entering after the end of December of this year, which is called the recognition period. And the statutory instruments that Steve mentioned allows us, the UK, to continue to accept the output of an organisation that was approved by EASA at the end of the transition period, i.e. the end of this year, for a maximum of a further 2 years, as if that organisation had been approved by the CAA. So from a production organisation point of view, that means that anything that's issued by an organisation approved by EASA under its privileges during that 2-year further period will remain acceptable to the UK. For you as production organisations, this means 2 areas. You can accept the output of an EASA DOA for the means of providing you with design data to continue to manufacture. So the DOA-POA interface arrangements and subsequent documentation remain acceptable for that 2-year period. It also allows you to continue to use EASA production organisations and accept the EASA Form 1 release of parts that are coming into your supply chain to be included into your assemblies or final products. You can continue to accept the EASA Form 1 for another 2 years after the end of after the end of the transition period. EASA at the moment has, and the EU have no equivalent mechanism to do so in reverse. But we can accept them coming in under the statutory instruments that have been established. Now, that legal element of the provision, it's important to recognise it only applies to the approvals that are in place prior to the 1st of January 2021, that should read, so 31st of December 2020. So if it was EASA approved at the end of this year, you can continue to accept the output for another 2 years. Next slide, please. Now, those of you that are thinking a little bit ahead will be thinking, okay, so that means there's a 2-year period where I can accept everything that was from an organisation that was approved at the end of this year. But if there's a new EASA comes onto the market with an approval, then I can't accept their outputs, which means I'm going to need to put an extra check in at goods inwards to make sure that the part that's coming in or a design arrangement I'm signing was with an organisation that was approved at the end of this year. How am I going to manage that? Well, going back to Steve's presentation again, he mentioned that in a similar manner to the mechanism by which EASA issues its AMC and GM material, which is done by EASA itself, the CAA also will have the ability to issue certain decisions that arise from the impact of the UK regulation. And the first of these that we are planning to do, and we cannot do them until later on, probably into December for the actual final version of the wording, etc., because we have to await the outcome of these other discussions that have already been mentioned, is that if we get to a no deal, no agreement arrangement, then we will be looking to issue a decision that allows the continued recognition of the output, i.e. the Form 1 and the design data that comes from the EASA approved organisations throughout that recognition period, to basically remove that need for you to be querying, can I accept this Form 1? Has it come from an organisation that has only been approved after the end of the transition period? So the decision that the CAA is drafting at the moment, and that we cannot give you the final format of it because of the discussions, will be dealing with that. So to alleviate that, UK CAA will issue a policy decision to extend the acceptance provision to specific outputs from EASA organisations outside the UK, i.e. where the UK is not principal place of business, for those of you familiar with that terminology, for the 2-year recognition period on the basis of the current confidence and identicality with the EU system. Those specific outputs will mean the design data to enable you to manufacture under your CAA approval, and the incoming Form 1s. In terms of the stuff that's coming into goods inwards. And as I said earlier, this does not cover the EASA third country organisation approvals that will be issued to the POAs to supply into the EU with a Form 1. To maintain the ability to supply to the UK operators and to the bilateral partners, you need to maintain your CAA approval. Next slide, please. So to summarise what we've just gone through, from the 1st of January 2021, you have to transition to the CAA Form 1 to release to the UK and to your bilateral and to our bilateral partners. If your organisation has sought and obtained an EASA third country approval, then at that point we understand you start to use the EASA Form 1 to supply into the EU member states. And we cannot enter into any further queries or correspondence with you as to the administration of the approvals. We have no involvement with them at all. So if you have any questions about how they're going to work, you have to direct them straight to EASA. The UK and EU DOA and POA arrangements and statements of approved design data, the SADs, etc., to show that you've got evidence of eligibility for UK POAs to release the parts on the Form 1 is valid until the end of the recognition period, 31st December 2022. and the ability that you currently have to reduce the verification of incoming EASA Form 1s that you get from POAs issued by an EASA approval permitted by Part 21, i.e. that you don't have to do additional supplier quality assurance control. You can basically say they are an approved organisation, I'm accepting the output, then that also continues until the end of the recognition period, December 2022. Okay, next slide. Okay, the bilaterals have been mentioned in several places, and consistent with the 145 webinar, this is the position relating to the bilateral. Next slide, if you would. Okay, so from the 1st of January 2021, the current EU bilateral arrangements will no longer apply to the UK. In readiness for this, we have concluded through UK government directly with the US government and the FAA initially, and then with our other bilateral partners once we'd established those templates. We've concluded various new bilateral agreements to replace the current EU agreements with those other agreements that have been put in place. There is further webinars on this for those of you that have particular interest in those markets on the 18th and 19th of November, dealing with the DOAs and with the bilateral aspects. From the POA point of view, very, very little has changed. Okay, there are some evolutions on the design side, but on the production side, they are very, very similar. Basically, you can do today, or what you're able to do today, you can do from next year onwards, but you have to use the CAA Form 1 to do it. You will also notice, pardon me, that some additional states have come in addition to the long-term established partners of the FAA, Transport Canada, Brazil, etc. We now have the relevant agreements in place with Singapore and Japan, etc. And obviously we will continue to do those elements as we need to. Okay, next slide. Okay, which brings us to the end of the slide sessions. We'll now open it up to questions and answers, which Will administer. I've got a couple of slides here with pre-rehearsed questions in case nothing comes up at all and that nobody's got any questions at all, which I'll be happy to discuss, but otherwise open the elements up to the Q&A. And Will, I think it's over to yourself.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Michael. I hope everyone who is joining found that a particularly informative and educative session. As Mark said, we'll move on to Q&As now. The format will be I will ask the questions and either Mark or Steve, depending on the question, will answer it. Do feel free to submit anything you want. And as I said at the beginning of this call, if we don't get to your question by the end of this presentation at 2 o'clock, we will be following up with an email just to make sure that everyone has their questions answered. The first couple, I think you answered, Mark, throughout the session, but just quickly counter through them and reiterate the message. If you gain a third country EASA approval, do you use a CAA Form 1 or an EASA Form 1?
Okay, if you have a EASA third country approval and you are supplying to the EU, you supply with an EASA Form 1. If you are supplying to a UK organisation or to a UK bilateral partner, such as FAA, Transport Canada, etc., you use a CAA Form 1. The bilaterals that we have concluded with those organisations are clear that that is the release mechanism that should be used. So your EASA third country approval covers you for the release into the EU member states.
Great, thanks, Mark. There's a question here about the recognition period and defining it. I know you had a slide dedicated to this. I think this question came in before you went through that slide, but do you just want to reiterate the 2-year message?
Yeah, the recognition period is a protection that's built into the statutory instruments. Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, which basically says that we can continue to accept specific outputs coming from the EASA system as if they had been issued by the CAA. And in the production context, that basically protects the DOA POA arrangements that you have got and your ability to be able to receive an EASA Form 1 from an EU member state with reduced, in effect, you take them as read when they come into goods inwards. You're not expected to exercise any kind of subcontractor control other than to confirm it's a legitimate release. This allows this system to go on for a further 2 years, which means that it's the one element that isn't really a reciprocal situation. At the moment, the EU has no mechanism to continue to accept the outputs from the UK on production. That's why they've put the third country organisation approvals in, effective as of the end of this year. The other way round, for stuff coming into the UK, we have this recognition period where we can continue to recognise the outputs of their approval for a maximum of 2 years.
Great, thanks, Mark. This participant read the flowchart as stating that Form 1s must be dated before the end of 2021 to be acceptable, but questions if the 2-year period is from the end of this year, then should this say that we accept EASA Form 1s dated before the end of 2022?
Yes, it should, but we can't put that into formal writing yet until we have the decision covered. I think the flowcharts themselves actually put that provision in, but we do have to be careful only to go into writing when we have the conclusion of the other agreements, and basically that we have the green light from government and from our policy teams to actually put that guidance into wording. But your correspondent is correct in reading it that way. We hope to be able to have that decision to allow us to continue to operate for that period.
And
can I just add to that one?
Go for it, Steve.
Prior to the 31st of December, we're accepting all Form 1s from no matter where they're coming from. As from the 1st of January, there is that point that Mark raised in his slides that from the 1st of January, we won't be accepting Form 1s from organisations here in the UK that have their PBOB here in the UK and have an EASA approval. So there is a differentiation that happens on the 31st of December, 1st of January deadline.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's important to identify that one of the consequences of this is that come the 1st of January, organisations will have, and it comes back to that first question that came into you, Will, organisations will have to ask themselves a question, where am I shipping this to? Because if I'm shipping it to a UK customer or to a bilateral partner, I need to ship it with a Form 1. If I'm shipping it to a EU customer, then for it not to get rejected at their goods inwards, then it will be expected to be released on an EASA Form 1 if you have sought and obtained a third country overseas approval. That's the difference.
Great, thank you, guys. Will the CAA have to approve under a CAA DOA the design data applicable to G-registered aircraft and the bilateral partners?
I think I'm going to defer that to the webinar that we have on design itself. I have received a specific question in writing regarding this element, which the answer is currently being agreed with our certification manager. So I will defer that one to the design webinar, if I may, because it's related specifically to that. And if you don't feel that the design webinar, if you're not on it or you don't feel that it answers a question, email it in and we will make sure you get a response.
Great, thanks, Mark. If I have a DO-PO arrangements, which make a part eligible to be released with the EASA Form 1 and CAA Form 1, can I issue both?
My answer, and again, Steve will correct me, is if you receive a request for 2 certificates, then there is nothing within the UK provision to stop you from doing that. I can quite understand it if an organisation receives a purchase order from a stockist who wishes to be able to potentially supply the parts into both markets. They may well ask for 2 releases. You can't get a dual release because obviously you can't have an EASA Form 1 and a CAA Form 1 with 2 signatures, etc. It's not like the other maintenance arrangements, etc. But if your customer requests 2 releases, then from the CAA point of view, I have no way of stopping you from releasing it on a CAA Form 1, as long as you have our approval. We would not want is to introduce any kind of referencing to each other's certificates, because there is no provision in the release certificates for cross-referring to other authority approvals, etc., etc. If you're making a release on a CAA Form 1, you are releasing under a CAA Form 1 for which we are the ICAO member responsible as far as we are concerned.
Great, thanks, Mark. Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
I've got nothing to add, thank you.
Great, thank you. This participant has a POA and MOA and will have a 21G and 145 TCO. How can they easily distinguish whether they need a CAA Form 1 or TCO EASA Form 1 to release parts from the stores to Part 145 repair station?
If it's a UK, if they have manufactured it and they are supplying it to their maintenance organisation, then my understanding from which will include that flow chart is to be acceptable to the UK, it needs to come from the UK CAA production approval. If you're supplying it to another EASA approved maintenance organisation, then it would have to be shipped with an EASA Form 1 to be acceptable. So think of your your maintenance approval as an internal UK customer, and it will be looking from a UK production organisation for a UK release. Great,
thank you. Steve, we'll give this one to you. Give Mark a chance to catch his breath and have a sip of water. From the 1st of January, will an FAA Form 8130 be acceptable?
Okay, the US Form 8130 will be acceptable under the terms of the bilateral agreement. Exact details will be can be found in the agreement, and as already mentioned, there are bilateral webinars next week which will go into the exact details of what is acceptable.
And Steve, we'll give another one to you. This participant's primary customers are based in the European Union. How can they obtain TCO approval, or would this be automatic after January 2021?
It is not automatic, because your POA approval is a UK issued approval. You do have to make an application to EASA, and then they will process that application. If you go to the EASA website, and I think it's under a Brexit tab, there are screens on there, and it details how you can make that application. And I believe the forms and everything are readily available. So you actually have to go to EASA, make an application, submit it, and then they will deal with that and process it.
I suspect I know your answer to this one, Steve, which is a follow-up supplementary question, that it's up to EASA, but how long will that TCO approval process take?
I'm afraid I've got no idea. So it's definitely up to EASA and the EASA teams.
And one more for you, Steve, before we move back to Mark. Any updates on the UK-EU bilateral?
At the moment, it is in negotiation. We are not getting very much feedback. It is very dependent on the bigger political picture that is going on. So you've got probably as much information as we have from the news. So please keep watching the news.
I think that point is worth reiterating, is that it is part of the trade agreement, the full trade agreement being negotiated between the EU and the UK. So you'll all, I'm sure, be aware of the challenges around fisheries and state aid, which affects all segments of the economy. Mark, moving back to you, what happens to our Airbus SADD or EOADD after the 2-year period?
That will depend very much on whether there has, in that subsequent 2-year period, been any further progress on concluding a bilateral with the EU. And then if there hasn't, then we would, obviously we are planning for the longer term future as to what would be necessary. Probably not a great deal of value in speculating what that outcome would be, because I think if we don't achieve an agreement by the end of the year, then we'll be looking for some kind of continued discussion. So probably not really valuable to speculate on that.
And if a product or component is released under an EASA Form 1 before the end of the transition period, so that's before the end of 31 December this year, can it be used by an operator in the UK after the end of the recognition period?
It's a very important scenario. We have been careful in all of the previous outputs to recognize the releases that have been given preceding a particular period. That's something we'll obviously have to talk through with Steve and the policy team. So I'll log it, but none of the decisions we've taken so far has basically invalidated a previous release. So I can't give you a copper bottom guarantee, but obviously I would not be looking to agree with policy something that in effect rendered those releases invalid. The whole point of what we're doing is to continue to the supply of the necessary spares through the aviation community. So I think you can take it that we would log that question and make sure that we addressed it in whatever our outcomes would be.
No,
yeah, by all means, Steve.
One. As you're already aware, we've mentioned the Form 1 and there were some dates on there. The decision that we will publish, if it's absolutely required, we will recognise all Form 1s coming out of UK organisations if they are dated prior to the 1st of January 2021, and that will be in the decision.
Thanks both. An easy follow-up one for you, Steve. Where can I get the CAA Form 1 template from?
The Form 1 template is available on our website, on the microsite. It's under the POA tab, and I believe it's also under the maintenance tab under the 145. So it is already up there and it's already accessible.
Great, thanks. Mark, is the current POA as approved by the UK CAA under EASA regulations valid for the EASA TCO approval?
I don't believe so. I know that EASA will want to see it as part of the evidence package that they have been asking for in support of the TCO. I do not know whether they insist on their own exposition being generated. So I don't feel that they will find our one to be completely legally valid for them, but they are certainly asking to see it as part of the package of information that UK POAs are being asked to provide as part of the TCO process.
Great, thank you. For parts shipped to a forward stocking station or spares release where we don't know the aircraft registration state, are we allowed to issue multiple Form 1s to cover all outcomes?
I think we've covered this question earlier in that if you are intending to supply to the two markets and you have the two approvals, this is the crucial thing. If you've got a UK approval and you have an EASA TCO, then you can issue the two certificates under the two separate approvals. Obviously, it's something we would rather not have to do because it's an addition to over what has to happen now. But at the moment, pending no other outcome from the negotiations, then they are two standalone approvals. And if your customer asks for, can I have two Form 1s, because I don't know where the parts are going to go, there is nothing to my knowledge in the regulations on either side that says that you can't do that. So yes, for the CAA Form 1, as to whether EASA are happy for the EASA Form 1 to be used in that way, you'll have to ask them because I can't give you an answer on their behalf.
Great, thanks, thanks, Mark. How would we release a new spare to an airline outside of the European Union and also outside of bilateral partners, for instance, Emirates?
Yeah, good question. The answer is you ask the customer, what do they want? If the national authority for looking after Emirates will accept a CAA Form 1, then you're good to go. If they insist on an EASA Form 1 release, then you're going to need an EASA TCO. So the answer to that one is ask the customer, and ask it before you ship it. Otherwise, you may well find it impounded or held and delayed until the validity of the release paperwork is confirmed.
Thanks, Mark. Here's another question around design. So it might be another one to defer until Wednesday, but are designs approved after the 1st of January by an existing EASA DOA acceptable in the UK?
It's a classic CAA. It depends, because it is something that will definitely be discussed during the design seminar, and the questionnaire that has already been passed to that team. So I would very much expect that question to be specifically addressed during the seminar itself. We have the ability and in fact the obligation to validate in certain circumstances. So it is not a guaranteed acceptance by any means, but it is depending on the significance of the design change. But the DOA seminar will go into that in depth. So if you're not signed up for that already, make sure that you are.
Great, thanks, Mark. We'll give this one to Steve. Can a UK Part 145 organisation accept a CAA Form 1 from a UK-based EASA third country approved organisation?
The answer to that is a no. If you're supplying into a UK 145, you need to hold a UK POA approval. So you have to release the component on the CAA Form 1 for the UK 145 to be able to accept that part.
And if I could just come in on the answer, the question said, can I release it on a CAA Form 1 from an EASA third country approval? No, you can't. They are two totally different standalone approvals. You can only issue an EASA Form 1 from an EASA TCO. You can't mix the two.
Great, thanks, Mark. Will the alternative means of compliance and GM remain in line with the EASA for the 2-year period? After this, is it likely the regulation could vary between EASA and the CAA?
Okay, I'll take that one.
Steve?
Yep. As already mentioned, the aviation regulation comes across, and that is fixed on the 31st of December. The AMC and GM has not been brought across under the same mechanism, because that would actually put it into UK law, and that material is not law. So there is another UK CAA decision that will be issued at the end of this year that brings across all the AMC and GM, but again, it will be fixed on the 31st of December. Going forward, when we move into our own policy and rulemaking process, that's not only for the regulation, that also includes the AMC and GM. So it will form part of our complete package of work. If we need to make changes, it will go through due process. So we may keep alignment for a period, we may not. It very much depends on what direction we want to go, and the demands and any other inputs that may affect our rulemaking process.
And is there any guidance as to any statement required for Block 12, that is bilateral statements?
There's nothing. Sorry, Steve, do you want to take?
No, I'll let you do that one.
Yeah, there's nothing new. The completion instructions for the Form 1 remain identical between what you've currently got and what is required for the CAA Form 1. I'm trying to remember whether the completion instructions used to put that kind of detail in, but they got significantly reduced a few years ago as to what you actually have to state. But I would say the simple answer is nothing has changed as a result of the EU exit process on this one. You fill them in as you have been doing before.
Great. Here's another scenario. If you're supplying into a European company, for instance, Leonardo Helicopters, but the parts are actually shipped to a UK location, which Form 1 would you use?
Excellent question. The answer is, and it also applies to Airbus as well, the European company, okay? Leonardo Helicopters, the production approval is an Italian production approval, so it's an EU member state. Airbus is an EU approval, so it's actually approved directly from EASA itself. In those cases, an EASA Form 1 would be required for the EU member state or for EASA itself to be able to accept those items. We are aware that several of the major TC organisations have already been in contact with their supply chain to advise what the acceptable extent of certification will be as a result of the UK exit from the EU. And it goes back to you need to clarify with your customer what the expected release basis is.
And Mark, does it matter when the EASA Form 1 is issued, before or after the 1st of January?
Right, if I was a UK POA shipping to Leonardo, then up until the end of this year, my CAA generated EASA Form 1, for want of a better phrase, okay, so it's the EASA Form 1 issued under the current approval, that's perfectly valid and is accepted under the withdrawal agreement that Steve referred to. After that date, then Leonardo would no longer be able to accept, as I understand it, a Form 1 release, EASA Form 1 release coming from the UK. So from the 1st of January onwards, you would have to supply on an EASA Form 1. And from the 1st of January onwards, the only approval that you could do that from is through an EASA TCO. Okay, so that cutoff is absolutely important. And that's where it is. It's what the customer requires. The customers should have specified by now, certainly at TC holder level, because I know two of the TC holders that I've been dealing with made this clear nearly a year ago as to what the allowable documentation would be as the EU Commission amended its own documentation. Okay, so customer should know what form they are able to accept. If they want an EASA Form 1, as of the end of this year, you will no longer be able to give it to them unless you've got an EASA TCO. If they're happy with a CAA Form 1, then you can continue to release after the 1st of January this year.
Thanks, Mark. If an organisation's UK site has transitioned to another of its EU Site 21G approvals, that is, the UK site is now inside the scope of another EU's site's POA and hence monitored by another airworthiness authority, is there anything else for the UK site to do to be prepared for the end of the transition period?
No. Is simple answer for that one. There are several organisations, or actually not very many organisations have done this, but for the purposes of Part 21, you are an additional site located in the UK, which is administered from the state of the home approval. So you can continue to release on the EASA Form 1 approval. Of course, your Form 1, because you were approved before the end of this year, your Form 1s will continue to be acceptable into the UK, but for a maximum period of 2 years under the recognition agreement. And as I've already said, what the end game is after that will very much depend on other negotiations. So at the moment, for that point of view, no.
Thanks, Mark. And here's one for Steve, I think. Are you seeking a bilateral agreement with the GCAA, which of course is the NAA of the UAE, to accept UK CAA Form 1s?
As already mentioned, we've already done a lot of work through ICAO and with in communication with the NAAs directly to give them the information of what's happening. Currently, our focus is on the UK-EU bilateral agreement, and once that has been finalised, we will then move on to other states. But the direction and priority has not been decided. That will be, as with all bilateral agreements, that is a government decision as to what priorities we place on certain states. So no decision has yet been made, and no decision has been made as to what their level of priority will be.
Thanks, Steve. And Mark, can a UK TCO use an EASA Form 1 to approve parts to another UK TCO?
So for UK third country approval using EASA Form 1 to approve parts to another UK third country. I'll have to defer that to EASA, because if it's a third country overseas approval, its use and when you can and cannot use it is not down to us, it is down to EASA. So you are going to have to ask that question directly of EASA, even though I have an opinion. Sorry.
That's all right. And Steve, how long will EASA point 21G.XXX reference numbers be valid? So how long will EASA reference numbers be valid?
As we move into next year, as I said, the regulation comes across as is. The references don't change, and the technical content doesn't change. So all the references that you know today will be those references that you'll use as you go forward. So if
Steve,
yes,
just point out those are EASA references, not UK references.
What you mean?
So those are third country approval references, TCO references. So they'll be valid for as long as the EU considers that. That's not our reference.
Sorry, it's misunderstanding.
That's all right. No, the third country overseas approval, the EASA references that you've just given there, that would not be our approval. The UK.21G.XXX, that's our approval, and that's what Steve has just been mentioning too. Yeah. The EU ones will remain as valid as long as the EU continues to exercise them.
Great, thank you for that clarification, Mark. We have 5 minutes left, so time for a couple more questions. As I said at the beginning, if we don't get to your question, don't worry. We will be able to follow up with an email so long as you submitted your question not anonymously. Can a POA approval with significant subcontractor change with immediate effect the release to a CAA Form 1? I'm not sure that's entirely clear, but it might be to you, Mark.
I think, yeah, the answer is it's in my first slide. Sorry, it's in Michael's first slide where he said that you have to make, that it's the subcontractors that you have listed under your approval that make releases on your behalf. So let's say you have a production site in the Philippines that is manufacturing under the authority of the CAA's approval as a second site, or you've identified a significant subcontractor in the Philippines that you want to be able to make releases on your behalf, they have to shift to being CAA Form 1 releases from the 1st of January. So the answer is in Michael's first or second slide.
And if an organization has CAA Part 21G and third country approval with EASA, would we be subjected to different regulatory audits, or will the CAA continue to carry these out on behalf of EASA?
They are separate approvals. We have no arrangement with the EU or EASA to carry out oversight on their behalf. And we will be doing our own oversight because we are the OKO state.
Thanks, Mark. If we are shipping products to UK customers after the 31st of December, will it be on a CAA Form 1?
Yes, I would say, but do check that your UK customer isn't, in fact, an arm of a European approved organisation. The two obvious ones here are Leonardo, which we've already mentioned, headquartered in and approved from ENAC in Italy, and of course Airbus itself, which does not have a UK production approval. It is an EU approved production organisation. So just because you're shipping it to the UK, don't automatically think you're going to be using a CAA Form 1. It's that classic ask the customer question again, because if they are part of an EU approved arrangement, then the CAA Form 1 will probably not be acceptable to them after the end of this year.
Great, thanks, thanks, Mark. Would an EU design organisation require a UK CAA approval to release approved design data to the UK production organisation after the recognition period ends? This might be another one for the session on Wednesday.
Again, I'll answer that one. It will depend on the outcome of any negotiations that would occur within the recognition period. The whole point of the recognition period is to keep things flowing in that 2-year period, if we come out of the end of the 2 years with absolutely no agreement, etc., then we would have to look at what we have to put in place. And you can anticipate that we are already doing scenario planning for the various options once we come out of the recognition period.
Great, thanks. Last couple of questions now. Steve, will the bilaterals you mentioned all be in place for the 1st of January 2021? And when will the agreements be published so we can inform our customers in the bilateral countries, that's not the European Union, that they can accept a CAA Form 1 from the 1st January 2021?
So all the bilaterals will be in place by the end of the year, as and when they're finalised, because some of them are going through some updates at the moment, or for signature, they will be published on the on our website. So all the information will be there for anybody to see. And what was the last part of the question, please?
Yes, bear with me one moment. When will the agreements be published so we can inform our customers of the bilateral arrangements?
Yeah, they will all be They will be published by the end of this year. Some of them are already up on the website. So yes, they're going up as and when they're signed.
Thank you. And then final question for this session. With an EASA TCO, this does not allow use of those bilaterals. Therefore, an EASA Form 1 could not be used. Therefore, only a CAA Form 1 could be used if authorized by that NAA. Is that a correct statement? Do you want me to repeat that one?
I think I've got it.
Okay.
Yes, if you're in the UK, then to take benefit of the bilaterals, you have to issue anything with a CAA Form 1 for them to be accepted by those bilateral partners.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with Steve on that. It's a yes is the answer, straight answer to the question.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for your questions. As I say, if we didn't get to them, apologies for that, but we will be following up with an email directly to you. Thank you to Mark and Steve and Michael for taking the time to answer these questions and run through the presentation. As I said at the top of this session, this session has been recorded, including the Q&A, so we will be sending it to all participants and indeed those who couldn't make it via email in the next couple of days. And for further information about our series of webinars that we're running over the course of the next few weeks, please do visit that dedicated EU Exit microsite at info.caa.co.uk/EU Exit. Many thanks and enjoy your Monday afternoon.